What's up, boys? Welcome back to the live stream. I just got to double check that everything's working properly. Sorry, just bear with me for a moment. Let's see. Yep, everything's working perfectly. Perfect. Welcome back, boys, to the podcast. It's been a little bit. I know I said I was going to do it every week. Obviously, it didn't turn out like that. I have taken a little bit of a break. But we're back and we're better than ever. So the topic that I wanted to talk about in this video is, does the UFC have a star problem? This has been a real topic for debate along a bunch of MMA fans on Twitter, just MMA spaces in general. There's a lot of concern and questions, I guess, on whether or not the UFC is falling off. Obviously, a lot of the events they've been putting on as of late haven't been the best. The pay-per-views have seemed to been a little bit watered down as of late. The Apex cards are obviously getting too much. The fact that they're in the Apex still is kind of crazy. And also the actual name value and talent level that's on Apex cards obviously also has to get better. There was a time in the past, COVID or prior to COVID, or even after COVID, where they were stacking these cards up. Now it seems like every year you get maybe 2, maybe 3 cards a year that are really good, really stacked. I'm talking about pay-per-views. And the rest of the pay-per-views are just all right. Some of them are really bad, some of them are just all right. But it just seems like Saudi Arabia, New York, and Miami, those 3 cards are usually always stacked up. And then outside of that, everything else is just like good, not great, or terrible, to be honest. So there are some questions and concerns that I think are actually valid with this. But in my opinion, whether or not the UFC actually has a star problem, I don't necessarily think so. I think whether or not they have stars, they're going to be successful. There's obviously a lot of guys that are very popular and a lot of guys that are going to sell pay-per-views. Now, obviously, do they have a Conor McGregor on their roster right now? No. I mean, Conor is on the roster, but he's not going to fight, obviously. So outside of him, do they have a Conor McGregor level fighter? No, and I don't necessarily know if they ever will find that. Do they have a Brock Lesnar guy? Probably not. Do they have a Khabib? Definitely not. But with that being said, there still are guys that are popular in the UFC. Islam Makhachev is popular, especially overseas in Russia and some other places in the world. John Jones is still a talent. He's still a star. He doesn't fight that much, and I guess that's the big problem. But in terms of the name value and selling pay-per-views and all that stuff, I still do believe that John Jones is a big fight, regardless of who he fights, and especially if he does fight Tom Aspinall. I do think there is some real draw to that, and it would be a pay-per-view that sells very well. Ilya Taporia is an up-and-coming star. I mean, I think he's already a star, but as time but as time does progress, I think he's going to become a bigger and bigger star, especially if he beats Islam. I think Islam versus Ilya just has to happen. I'll touch upon that a little bit more later, but whoever wins that fight is really going to take their stardom level to the next level. If Islam beats Ilya, I think he's going to become a much bigger star than he currently is, and especially if Ilya beats Islam, he's really going to cement himself to be the biggest star in the UFC. In my opinion, actually, I don't think it'll be all that close. And I think he'll, just for his legacy wise, he's going to be known possibly as one of the greats. But outside of him, Dricus is a guy that, he sells pay-per-views, but he's not nearly as big of a star as some of the other guys that I mentioned. Magomed Ankalaev is not really a star at this point. I guess he could be, especially if he beats Alex in the rematch and he finishes him. I think that could do wonders for his star power. Obviously, Bilal is not really much of a star. Alex Pereira is a star. Unfortunately, he's not. Unfortunately for him, he's not the champ anymore. So his star power could potentially take a little bit of a hit. But I think if he beats Magomed in the rematch, which is a big if, I think his star power is right back. And then he would have a lot of options going from there. Tom Aspinall can sell pay-per-views. Alexander Volkanovski. Sean O'Malley even a little bit, although it is a little bit overblown. Charles Oliveira is a great talent and a very popular guy. Basically, the point that I'm trying to make is, yes, the UFC can use a Conor McGregor level star. It would help tremendously. You just throw Conor McGregor on any card, he'll sell tremendously. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is the UFC brand is enough, at least at this point, to eventually find that star, or even if they aren't able to do so, I think they can still sell pay-per-views. I think the real problem and the real thing that people should be focusing on is the actual quality of the cards as of late. Apex cards in general should be gone at this point. The actual facility of the Apex is just not good at this point. It was great during COVID. It served its purpose, but it's kind of run its course at this point. We need crowds, we need stadiums, we need arenas. That's really where you get exciting fights and memorable moments in the UFC. So I think in terms of fight nights, they do need to upgrade, go to more places. Now, as of late, they are actually going to a few different places, which is actually very nice to see, as they're going to London this week. Next week, they're going to Mexico City. They're also going to where else are they going? This I forgot where this is. It doesn't say. Let's see. Does it say? No. Iowa. I believe it's Iowa. But anyways, they are going to different places, which I do appreciate and I do like. But they have to do more of that. And I think outside of just fight night cards, because fight night cards aren't really going to be your main money makers. Really, where the UFC is going to make their money with pay-per-views and whatever they decide to do, if they go with Netflix with a non-pay-per-view method, whatever they decide to do, they're going to make most of their money on the pay-per-views, obviously. So the big issue, in my opinion, for why they're not selling is not necessarily the names at the top of the ticket. Like, I think Alex Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev should sell pretty well. That's a big fight. But outside of that main event, you have to have big names under them as well. Now, Gaethje Fiziev was a good fight for sure, but as you look down on the card, it just gets a little bit weaker and weaker. And I'm not even only singling out this last pay-per-view. It's been a trend for the UFC. It really has, where some of their pay-per-views are just not stacked. You get one good fight or decent fight at the top of the ticket, and that's really it. You may get a couple other fights sprinkled in there that are good fights. Maybe you'll get some nice contender fights, young up-and-comers that turn out to be great fights for sure. But in terms of going into it, the star power, the name power isn't necessarily there all the time. And I think that's really the biggest issue with the UFC. And even when I talked about before about the Apex cards, it's not that the Apex cards are always horrible. Sometimes they are, but it's not that they're always horrible in terms of an entertainment factor. There's some fights, some young up and comers that are actually very exciting fighters, and they put on very exciting performances. It just, when you're not in front of a crowd, it just makes these events so much less memorable. And I do think that is holding the UFC back. Now, do they care? I don't know. I'm honestly, I feel like they probably don't care. They're making money regardless. But in terms of a fan's perspective, I would like to see them get out of the Apex, put on some more fight nights in places, go different places, go around Europe, go to Africa. They've been saying that forever. Go to Spain. They've been saying that forever. There's so many places that I believe the UFC can go to that will make the product better overall. And for the pay-per-views, just beef up the pay-per-views a little bit more. But the next thing that I wanted to get into, which is, this is actually my Twitter. If you guys don't follow me already, follow me on Twitter or X at MMA_juicy. But the point that I was trying to make here is the UFC needs a rivalry. Really, the last time we had a rivalry that was of anything meaningful was Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya. But those kind of rivalries where they fight once, twice, or even three times are huge fights. They bring in the draw. There's obviously a big draw for it. The Izzy and Alex fight just had tremendous aura to it, both in the first fight and in the second fight. Obviously, they had history leading up to the first one. And in the second one, Alex Pereira was at that time 3-0 against Israel Adesanya. So there's just great aura to it, and there's great story to it. Obviously, John Jones versus DC. There's just so many examples of rivalries in the UFC turning out to be a cash cow for the UFC. And I think we need that at this point. And I think the next possible rivalry could be Ilia Topuria versus Islam Makhachev. Because both of these guys are currently top 3 pound-for-pound fighters. Both of these guys are in their prime. And although a lot of people are picking Islam Makhachev to beat Ilia, I do think there is a real chance that Ilia could win based on his boxing ability, based on his versatility, based on his power. And he will be smaller than Islam. Yes, that is true. But at the same time, I do think there are a lot of skills and ways he can look to utilize to actually win this fight. So I do think this could be somewhere a direction that the UFC looks towards or should look towards. I know Islam has declined the fight, so I guess Ilya is going to need to fight somebody else in the meantime. But I just think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity if these guys never do fight. If Ilya does fight a Charles Oliveira, if he does fight a Dustin Poirier, or even Paddy Pimblett, if Paddy beats Michael Chandler, and then he fights Islam Makhachev and beats him, yes, I think the fight actually is even bigger. But there is a risk to that. We see that all the time in boxing where where there's a big fight that everybody wants to see between two guys, but one of those two guys fights somebody else before they fight the main fight that they want to, and maybe that fighter loses, and it just throws everything off kilter. So I think if you have the chance to make this huge fight, you just do it. We'll see what happens. It seems like it won't happen, but I guess we'll see what happens in this matchup. If we'll see. There was originally a report saying that Charles Oliveira didn't want to fight Ilia Topuria, but it seems like that isn't true. Now he's talking about possibly fighting for the BMF belt. So that could be cool for Charles Oliveira. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think the UFC is a tremendous product. Obviously, I'm going to be watching their fight nights. I'm going to be watching their pay-per-views regardless. But I think in terms of a fan's perspective, to make these cards better, to make it a little bit more exciting for fight nights, I think you have to get in arenas a little bit more, because when they do go to arenas, that also incentivizes them to put on better cards, because people aren't going to pay that much money to go to one of these typical Apex cards where there's not too much talent on it, or at least name value on it. So I do think that would be beneficial for the UFC and for the pay-per-views. Beef them up. It's not like they don't have the talent on the roster to beef up pay-per-views every week, or not every week, every month. They've done it a long time ago, 5-6 years ago. They were able to do it. So why wouldn't they be able to do it now? But anyways, I just thought I'd hop on live and discuss that, talk about the state of the UFC. A lot of people have been complaining, but we'll see what happens. I know also the UFC seems like they want to sign a deal with Netflix, which I personally think will be beneficial. I think change is good at this point. ESPN has kind of served its purpose. There are a lot of issues with ESPN Plus, people not being able to buy the pay-per-view, just technology of their app in general isn't necessarily the best. And I do think a change to Netflix could be beneficial for the user experience, but also I think it could be beneficial because the change may push the UFC to be a little bit better and do some of those things that I touched upon before. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the live stream. It was a quick little live stream. Just want to get on, talk about this. I do have a video coming out tomorrow, so be sure to check that out. And follow me on X at MMA_Juicy. I'll be posting daily. I talk about opinions that I have on certain fights. Sometimes I'll give predictions on certain fights on Twitter. And yeah, but anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video or the live stream, and peace out, boys.